Deputy Ben Carter hated the graveyard shift. It wasn't just the hours, it was the quiet. He'd been on the force for 14 years, and if he'd learned one thing, it was that quiet in a small town was never a good sign. Something always boiled under the surface. The radio crackled. Unit 5 to 3, we've got a report of a possible trespasser near Old Hollow Bridge. Old Hollow Bridge was a local landmark, a rickety, half-rotted structure stretching over a shallow creek on the outskirts of town. Kids went there to drink or scare each other with stories of the supposed suicides that happened back in the 70s. Ben sighed, adjusted his cap, and put the cruiser into drive. As he approached the bridge, his headlights cut through the mist hanging low in the air. The place looked abandoned, but his gut told him otherwise. He pulled over and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. "Dispatch, I'm on scene. Nothing visible yet, but I'll check it out," he said into the radio. The bridge groaned as he walked onto it, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. That's when he saw it. A figure crouched near the edge, its back to him. "Sheriff's Department," Ben called out. "You're trespassing. Show me your hands." The figure didn't move. It was oddly shaped, hunched low, with spindly arms bent at unnatural angles. Ben felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. "Hey, I said hands!" he barked, stepping closer. The figure finally turned. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow black pits where its eyes should have been. The mouth twisted into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Help me," it rasped, but the voice didn't match the face. It was a little girl's voice, soft and trembling. Ben staggered back, drawing his weapon. His finger hovered over the trigger as the thing cocked its head, watching him with an eerie stillness. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. Suddenly the creature lurched forward, faster than anything he'd ever seen. Ben fired, the gunshots echoing through the night, but the thing was already gone, vanishing into the trees. His hands shook as he lowered the gun. "Dispatch, I need backup at Old Hollow Bridge. Now," he said into his radio, but there was no response, just static. He sprinted back to his cruiser, his heart pounding. The air felt heavier, like the atmosphere before a storm. As he reached the car, he noticed something strange. His cruiser, parked on the gravel moments ago, was now sitting in the middle of the bridge, facing the opposite direction. "What the—" Ben approached cautiously, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. The driver's side door was open, and a faint smell of sulfur wafted from inside. On the windshield, written in what looked like blood, was a single word: leave. Ben didn't know how he got home that night. The drive was a blur, his mind replaying the figure's face over and over. He didn't tell anyone at the station what had happened, not then. Who would believe him? Instead, he filed a vague report about kids pulling pranks and a false alarm. But the nightmares started the next day. In his dreams, he was back on the bridge. The figure was there, whispering his name. Sometimes it had the voice of a little girl. Other times it sounded like his late wife, who died in a car crash 5 years earlier. And then the disappearances began. It started small. A stray dog went missing from the gas station on Route 12. A week later, a teenager failed to return home after visiting friends. Each time, the victims were last seen near Old Hollow Bridge. Ben knew it couldn't be a coincidence. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down he knew the thing he'd seen was behind it all. One night, the dreams turned worse. He woke up drenched in sweat, a single phrase burned into his mind: "Bring it back." The next day he drove to the bridge, determined to end whatever this was. He carried his shotgun, a flashlight, and a Bible, just in case. As he stepped onto the bridge, the air grew colder. The world seemed to hold its breath. "All right, I'm here," he called out. "What do you want?" The reply came from everywhere and nowhere, a deep, guttural voice that reverberated in his chest. "Return what you took." "I didn't take anything," he shouted, his voice cracking. The shadows around him shifted, coalescing into the figure from that night. Its grin was wider now, impossibly so. "You stole the child," it hissed. Ben froze. "What? What are you talking about?" The creature lunged at him, and he fired. The shotgun blast echoed, but the figure dissolved into smoke, reforming behind him. "The child is ours. Bring it back, or more will disappear." And then it was gone. Over the next few days, Ben pieced together the truth. Decades ago, a family had lived near the bridge, a reclusive couple with a young daughter. When the little girl went missing, the town assumed the parents had something to do with it. They were lynched by an angry mob and buried in unmarked graves near the creek, but the girl was never found. Ben realized what the creature wanted: justice or revenge, maybe both. The last entry in Ben's journal was dated October 31st, the night he vanished. His cruiser was found abandoned on Old Hollow Bridge. The words "Justice Served" scrawled on the windshield. No one knows what really happened to Deputy Ben Carter, but the disappearances stopped after that night. And if you ask the locals, they'll tell you to avoid Old Hollow Bridge. Because sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear a voice whispering from the shadows, "Help me." Patrolman Jack Rourke had been with the Morning Hollow Police Department for 6 years, and in all that time, he'd never once seen anything worth writing home about. The most action he'd ever encountered was busting a meth lab in a trailer park and a couple of Friday night bar fights. Morning Hollow was small-town boring, the kind of place where you knew everyone, and nothing weird ever happened. At least that's what Jack thought, until the night of the fog. It was late October, a few days before Halloween, when the call came in. Unit 2-1, report to mile marker 19 on Deer Run Road. Caller reports an abandoned vehicle with hazards on. Jack grabbed the radio from its cradle. Unit 2-1 responding. Deer Run Road wasn't a busy street. It was a stretch of old blacktop winding through the woods, mostly used by truckers avoiding way stations. Jack drove with his window cracked, the chill night air biting at his face. A thick fog rolled across the road, swirling like smoke under his headlights. He spotted the car, a rusted-out Chevy Nova, its hazard lights blinking like dying fireflies. It was pulled over onto the shoulder, one tire in the ditch. Jack stopped behind it, activated his cruiser's lights, and stepped out. The air smelled off, not the earthy, damp scent of the woods, but something metallic, like blood. "Morning Hollow PD," he called, approaching the vehicle. "Anybody in there?" The car was empty. The driver's side door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Jack shined his flashlight inside. The keys were still in the ignition, and a half-empty can of Coors sat in the cup holder. What caught his attention, though, was the note on the dashboard. "Do not listen, do not follow." "What the hell?" Jack muttered, pulling out his notepad. The sound of branches snapping behind him made him whirl around, hand hovering near his holster. "Hello? Is someone out there?" Silence. Jack's flashlight beam danced across the tree line, catching glimpses of gnarled branches and swirling fog. Just as he turned back toward the cruiser, he heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, almost like a child's laugh carried on the wind. Then it grew louder, a raspy whisper repeating his name. "Jack. Jack." He froze, the hair on his arm standing on end. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispering stopped. Then, from deep within the woods, came a scream, a gut-wrenching, inhuman wail that sounded like metal scraping against bone. Jack's instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet moved anyway, pulling him toward the trees. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of Jack's boots on the dirt. The beam of his flashlight cut through the fog, revealing shapes that seemed to shift and warp in the shadows. "Jack, help me." The voice was clearer now, closer. It sounded like a woman's voice, familiar, but wrong. "Show yourself," Jack yelled, spinning in a circle. Something moved to his left. He turned the flashlight toward it and saw her. It was his wife. She stood barefoot in the fog, wearing the white dress she'd been buried in 2 years ago. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "Claire," Jack whispered. Her lips didn't move, but he heard her voice in his head. "You shouldn't have come here." Before he could respond, she let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound hit him like a physical force, dropping him to his knees. When he looked up, she was gone. Jack stumbled back to the road, his mind racing. He reached for his radio, but static greeted him. His cruiser was still there, its lights flashing in the fog. But something was wrong. The car looked older. The paint was chipped, the tires deflated. It was like it had been sitting there for years. Jack climbed inside, locking the doors. The smell of decay hit him immediately, making him gag. On the passenger seat was something that hadn't been there before. A photograph. It was a picture of him, standing in front of his cruiser, with a figure behind him. Tall, dark, and featureless, like a shadow come to life. The radio crackled. Unit 2-1. Report. Come in. Jack grabbed the mic. Dispatch, this is Rourke. I need backup at mile marker 19, now. There was a pause. Then a voice came through. A voice he hadn't heard in 2 years. Jack, it's Claire. Don't let it out. The line went dead. Jack's headlights flickered. The shadow from the photograph was no longer behind him. It was in front of him, standing in the middle of the road. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, impossibly tall, its edges blurring into the fog. Jack floored the accelerator, aiming straight for it, but the car sputtered and died before it reached the figure. The shadow drifted closer, and as it did, Jack felt an overwhelming urge to open the door, to step outside and walk into its arms. No, he whispered, gripping the wheel. You're not real. The shadow stopped inches from the windshield, and for the first time it spoke. You brought me here. Jack's mind snapped. He screamed, slamming his fists against the dashboard, but when he looked up, the shadow was gone. They found his cruiser the next morning, parked on the side of Deer Run Road. The engine was cold, the battery drained. Jack was inside, slumped over the wheel, his eyes wide open and his face frozen in a mask of terror. On the passenger seat was a note written in blood. Do not listen, do not follow. The case remains unsolved. Deputies who patrol that stretch of road claim to hear voices in the fog, calling their names. No one dares to investigate. Deputy Chris Malone never liked working the night shift, but in Hemlock County, you didn't get to pick your hours. The small Pennsylvania town had more abandoned buildings than it did living residents, and nights were filled with prowlers, prank calls, and the occasional drunk driver trying to make it home. That night started like any other. The call came in at 2:13 a.m. Unit 5-2, report of trespassing at the old Winchester property. Caller reports lights inside the farmhouse. Chris sighed into the radio. Copy that. Unit 5-2 en route. The Winchester property was infamous around Hemlock, a sprawling farmhouse and barn on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for decades after the last owner, Samuel Winchester, vanished under strange circumstances. There were rumors, of course, ghost stories told around campfires about strange lights, missing hikers, and whispers of something evil in the woods. Chris didn't buy into that crap. But as he turned onto the gravel driveway and saw the house looming in the moonlight, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. The house looked worse than he remembered. Windows boarded up, the front door hanging on one hinge. But there was no mistaking the faint glow of light spilling out from one of the upstairs windows. Chris grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cruiser, his boots crunching on the gravel. Sheriff's Department, he called, his voice cutting through the silence. If anyone's in there, come out with your hands up. No response. Chris made his way up the creaking porch steps and pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and rot. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and cobwebs thick as cotton. He climbed the stairs cautiously, each step groaning under his weight. The light was coming from a room at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Last warning, Chris said, his hand resting on his holster. He nudged the door open with his foot. The room was empty. The light came from an old oil lantern sitting on the floor, its flame flickering weakly. Beside it was a Polaroid photograph, face down. Chris picked it up and flipped it over. It was a picture of him, standing in the doorway of the room. What the hell? He muttered, his stomach knotting. A sound behind him made him spin around, hand on his gun. The hallway was empty, but something was wrong. The shadows seemed deeper now, almost alive, writhing along the walls like they were breathing. Chris's radio crackled. Unit 5-2, respond. What do you see? It wasn't dispatch. The voice was distorted, low and guttural. Chris's pulse quickened. He pressed the radio to his lips. Who is this? Identify yourself. The radio went silent. Then came the laughter. It was faint at first, like a child giggling in another room. But it grew louder, echoing through the house, high-pitched and grating, like nails on a chalkboard. Chris backed down the hallway, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He reached the top of the stairs, but the steps were gone. Below him, where the staircase should have been, was nothing but a yawning black void. The laughter stopped. Chris, a voice whispered. It was close. Too close. He spun around and came face to face with himself. The other Chris stood inches away, wearing the same uniform, the same badge, but his eyes were black as coal, and his mouth was stretched into an unnatural smile. You shouldn't be here, the doppelganger said, its voice dripping with malice. Chris stumbled backward, his foot slipping over the edge of the void. He grabbed at the banister, but his fingers passed through it like smoke. As he fell, the world around him twisted and warped. The farmhouse dissolved into a swirling vortex of shadows and screaming faces, their mouths opening impossibly wide. Chris woke up in his cruiser. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The sun was rising, casting a pale orange glow over the Winchester property. The house was gone. All that remained was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken glass. Chris reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 5-2. I need someone to confirm the Winchester property address. The house is gone. There was a long pause. Unit 5-2, the Winchester property burned down 20 years ago. Are you feeling okay? Chris stared at the empty lot, his heart pounding. On the passenger seat was the Polaroid photograph, the same one he'd found in the house. This time, the picture was different. It showed him sitting in his cruiser, staring at something in the rearview mirror. He glanced up, and his blood ran cold. In the mirror, he saw the doppelganger. It was smiling, and it wasn't alone. Chris quit the force a week later. He moved out of Hemlock County, changed his name, and tried to forget what happened. But sometimes, late at night, he still hears the laughter. And when he looks in the mirror, he sees them watching. Deputy Carla Reynolds thought she'd seen it all in her 10 years on the force in Cedar Grove, Oregon. A quiet town nestled against miles of dense, untouched forest. Drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and the occasional meth lab bust made up the bulk of her shifts. But nothing had prepared her for the night of October 22nd. The call came in at 11:45 p.m., just as she was wrapping up a routine patrol near the outskirts of town. Unit 3-7, we've got reports of a parked car in Forest Line Loop, no driver seen. Caller says it's been sitting there for hours with the engine running. Carla sighed, rubbing her temples. Forest Line Loop was a dead-end road that butted up against the state park, a place locals avoided after dark. Superstition and urban legends painted the woods as haunted, but Carla chalked it up to kids trying to scare each other. Unit 3-7 responding. ETA 5 minutes, she said into her radio, flipping on her lights. The car was easy to spot. A beat-up blue sedan sat idling at the end of the gravel road, its headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the tree line. Carla parked a few feet behind it, her cruiser's spotlight illuminating the back of the vehicle. As she stepped out, the cold night air bit at her face. She approached cautiously, one hand resting on her holstered weapon. Cedar Grove PD, she called. Anyone in the vehicle? No response. The driver's window was rolled down slightly, and the faint smell of copper and earth wafted out. Carla's stomach churned as she shone her flashlight inside. The driver's seat was empty, but the passenger seat wasn't. A mannequin dressed in tattered clothing sat buckled in. Its head was tilted slightly, its blank face staring straight ahead. A note was pinned to its chest, written in shaky black marker. Take it back. Carla stepped back, her pulse quickening. What the hell? She circled the car, scanning the surrounding woods with her flashlight. The forest seemed unnaturally still. No wind, no rustling leaves, Not even the chirp of crickets. Returning to the driver's side, she reached for the door handle but froze. The driver's seat wasn't empty anymore. A figure sat there now, shrouded in shadow, its face obscured. Carla stumbled back, drawing her weapon. "Show me your hands," she barked. The figure didn't move. Out of the car now. Still nothing. With her flashlight trained on the figure, Carla edged closer, her heart pounding. She reached out to yank the door open, and the figure dissolved into black smoke, vanishing before her eyes. Carla staggered back, her mind racing. She fumbled for her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 37. I need backup at Forest Line Loop. Something's wrong here." There was static, followed by a faint whispering. "Who's out there?" she demanded, turning in circles. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices speaking words she couldn't understand. Her flashlight beam caught movement in the trees, a flash of white darting between the trunks. "Stop, police!" Carla shouted, running toward the figure. She followed it deeper into the woods, her boots crunching on the frozen underbrush. The whispering surrounded her now, growing more frantic, like a chorus of voices warning her to turn back. But she didn't. She couldn't. The forest opened into a small clearing, and Carla skidded to a stop. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the moonlight. At its base, a circle of crude wooden effigies surrounded a shallow pit. Inside the pit was another mannequin, this one dressed in a police uniform. Its chest bore a badge that read Reynolds. Carla's blood ran cold. "What is this?" she whispered. Behind her, the whispering stopped, and then came the laughter. She spun around, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. Dozens of pale, emaciated figures emerged from the shadows, their faces featureless and smooth like porcelain. They moved silently, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. Carla raised her weapon. "Stay back." The figures didn't stop. She fired a warning shot into the air, but the sound didn't echo. It was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the woods. The figures closed in, their blank faces mere inches from hers. Carla's breath hitched as she felt cold, bony fingers wrap around her wrist. The world tilted, and the ground fell away. When Carla woke, she was sitting in the driver's seat of her cruiser. Her head throbbed, and her mouth tasted like copper. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the empty road. The blue sedan was gone. Her radio crackled. "Unit 37, do you copy?" She grabbed the mic with shaking hands. "Dispatch, this is Unit 37. I'm here." "Reynolds, where the hell have you been? We've been trying to reach you for hours." Carla looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 6:17 a.m. She had no memory of the past 6 hours. She turned to check the back seat, and her stomach dropped. There, propped up against the seat, was the mannequin from the clearing. Pinned to its chest was a new note. "It's yours now." Carla resigned from the Cedar Grove Police Department the following week. She never told anyone what happened that night, but she couldn't escape it. The whispering followed her, growing louder with each passing day. And every morning, she found the mannequin waiting for her, on her porch, in her car, even at the foot of her bed. No matter where she went, it was always watching. Officer Mark Harlow had always prided himself on being a skeptic. He didn't believe in ghosts, aliens, or any of the small-town rumors that made their way into police chatter. To him, every weird occurrence had a logical explanation. That's why, when the dispatcher called him about an abandoned truck under the old Route 17 overpass, he didn't expect much beyond some drunk who'd wandered off. "Probably another idiot trying to avoid a DUI," Mark muttered, pulling his cruiser off the main road and onto the dirt path leading to the overpass. It was close to midnight, and the autumn fog rolled thick across the ground, making the world beyond his headlights feel like a dream. The truck came into view, a battered green Chevy, its driver's side door wide open. Mark parked behind it and stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the fog. "Cedar Hill PD. Anyone here?" Silence. The truck's engine was still running, the faint hum breaking the otherwise oppressive quiet. Mark walked up to the cab and leaned in, noting the smell, something sour like spoiled milk mixed with wet earth. On the passenger seat was a duffel bag, unzipped. Inside were tools: a crowbar, a saw, a rusty hammer. "Great," Mark muttered. "Another junkie scavenger." But there was no sign of anyone nearby. His radio crackled and he jumped. "Unit 12, you good?" Mark cleared his throat and pressed the button. "Yeah, I'm here. Just an abandoned vehicle. I'll run the plates and call it in." He was about to close the door when he noticed something scratched into the dashboard. 4 words, jagged and deep: "Don't go under there." Mark's gaze shifted to the overpass. The bridge above was old, built in the 1930s and long since closed to traffic. Below it, the space beneath the bridge yawned like a dark mouth, its edges obscured by fog. He felt a pang of unease, the kind that settled low in his gut. But he shook it off. A cop couldn't afford to get spooked by graffiti and shadows. Pulling his weapon just in case, Mark walked toward the underpass, his boots crunching on gravel. The smell hit him first, stronger now, sour and metallic. He swept his flashlight across the space, the beam revealing broken beer bottles, cigarette butts, and a makeshift bedroll shoved against the far wall. "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. Mark stepped closer, his light catching movement in the corner. A raccoon, scrawny and wild-eyed, scurried past him and disappeared into the dark. He exhaled, relieved, but then he saw the footprints. They were large, too large to be human, pressed deep into the damp dirt. Each print had 3 toes, with long claw-like indentations at the tips. Mark's heart rate picked up. What the hell? The prints led away from the bedroll and deeper into the shadows, toward the far side of the underpass. Against his better judgment, Mark followed them. The beam of his flashlight danced along the ground until it landed on something glinting in the dirt. He crouched down to pick it up, a small silver locket, its chain broken. He opened it. Inside was a faded photo of a little girl with curly hair and a gap-toothed smile. A low growl rumbled behind him. Mark spun around, his flashlight cutting through the fog. At first he saw nothing. Just the empty underpass and the pale mist swirling around the pillars. Then something moved. It stepped into the light slowly, as if testing him. The creature was tall, at least 7 feet, its gaunt body covered in mottled grayish skin that stretched taut over its ribs. Its head was elongated, with hollow pits where its eyes should have been, and a mouth that opened too wide, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. Mark froze, every instinct screaming at him to run. The creature tilted its head almost curiously before taking a step closer. Mark raised his gun. "Stop! Don't come any closer!" It didn't stop. He fired twice. The gunshots echoed through the underpass and the creature let out an ear-splitting screech, stumbling back into the shadows. For a moment, Mark thought it was over, but then the screeching multiplied, coming from all around him. There wasn't just one. Mark ran. He sprinted back toward his cruiser, his flashlight bouncing wildly in the fog. Behind him, the screeches grew louder, closer, accompanied by the sound of scraping claws on concrete. He reached the truck first, slamming the door shut and jumping into the driver's seat. He threw the car into reverse, tires spinning as he sped back up the dirt road. In his rearview mirror, he saw them, dozens of shadowy figures pouring out from under the bridge, their eyeless faces turned toward him. One of them leaped onto the back of the truck, its claws tearing into the metal. Mark swerved violently, sending it tumbling off into the ditch. When he reached the main road, he didn't stop. He drove straight back to the station, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The truck was towed the next day. Mark didn't go back to the overpass, not even to retrieve the locket he'd dropped in his panic. When he checked the police logs, he found something chilling. The truck's plates were registered to a man named Harold Givens, a convicted murderer who'd been released on parole 6 months earlier. Givens had disappeared shortly after his release, along with his young daughter, Emily. The case was never solved. Mark never told anyone what he saw that night, but sometimes, on quiet shifts, he thought he could hear it, the faint sound of screeches carried on the wind. Officer Jenna Briggs was used to the quiet monotony of night patrol in the small town of Silver Pines. A barking dog here, a drunk teenager there. Nothing ever happened that couldn't be wrapped up by sunrise. Until the night of October 17th. It started with a call from dispatch at 2:13 a.m. Unit 7, we've got a report of suspicious activity near the old Pine Hollow Cemetery. Caller mentioned hearing voices and seeing lights. Jenna sighed, leaning back in her cruiser. Pine Hollow was notorious for pranksters and ghost hunters. The cemetery, tucked deep in the woods at the edge of town, had been abandoned for decades, overgrown and crumbling. "Copy that, dispatch. I'm on my way," she replied, turning the wheel toward the winding back road that led to the cemetery. The drive was uneventful at first, the cruiser's headlights cutting through the dense canopy of trees. But as Jenna approached the cemetery gates, the familiar unease of the place began to creep in. The gates were ajar, rusted hinges groaning in the wind. Beyond them, the headstones jutted out of the ground like broken teeth shrouded in mist. Jenna parked her car and stepped out, flashlight in hand. She scanned the area, her breath visible in the cold night air. "Silver Pines PD, if anyone's here, make yourself known," she called. Silence. She moved deeper into the cemetery, boots crunching on the gravel path. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the place itself resented her presence. Then she heard it, a faint murmuring, low and rhythmic like a chant carried on the wind. Jenna's grip on her flashlight tightened. The sound was coming from the far side of the cemetery near the old crypts. She followed it, her pulse quickening with every step. The chanting grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't in English, at least not any English she recognized. The words were guttural, unnatural, making her skin crawl. She rounded a corner and froze. Near the largest crypt, a group of people stood in a circle, their faces obscured by dark hoods. In the center of the circle was a crude stone altar, stained dark with something Jenna didn't want to identify. One of the figures held a lantern, its flickering light casting grotesque shadows on the crypt walls. Jenna reached for her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I've got a group of individuals at Pine Hollow Cemetery, possibly engaged in some kind of ritual. I'm requesting immediate backup." The radio crackled, but no response came through. The chanting stopped abruptly, and every hooded head turned toward her in unison. "Silver Pines PD!" Jenna shouted, drawing her weapon. "Step away from the altar and keep your hands where I can see them." The figures didn't move. They just stared, their faces hidden in shadow. "Last warning!" Jenna's voice wavered slightly, but she held her ground. Then one of them stepped forward, lowering their hood. It was a man, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light. His lips twisted into a chilling smile. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and raspy. Jenna's finger twitched on the trigger. On the ground, now. The man tilted his head, unfazed. "Do you know what this place is, officer?" She didn't answer. "It's a doorway," he continued, gesturing toward the crypt. "And you're just in time to see it open." Before Jenna could react, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The crypt doors creaked open, and an icy wind rushed out, carrying with it the stench of decay. From the darkness of the crypt emerged a figure, impossibly tall, its body cloaked in shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth stretched into an inhuman grin, filled with jagged teeth. Jenna stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She fired her weapon, the shots echoing through the cemetery. The bullets passed through the creature as if it wasn't there. The hooded figures dropped to their knees, bowing before the monstrosity. The man who had spoken earlier looked up at Jenna, his smile widening. "You can't stop it. No one can." Jenna turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop until she reached her cruiser, slamming the door shut and peeling out onto the road. But as she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The creature was standing in the middle of the road, its glowing eyes locked on her. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The next morning, backup arrived at Pine Hollow Cemetery. They found no sign of the hooded figures, the altar, or the creature. The crypt was sealed, its doors rusted shut. Jenna filed her report, but she knew no one would believe her. Weeks later, she quit the force. She moved to another state, started a new life. But no matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed her. Every so often, in the dead of night, she would wake up to the faint sound of chanting, as if it were coming from just outside her window. Officer Mike Rourke hated the graveyard shift, but in the sleepy town of Greywater, it wasn't exactly high octane. Most nights were spent cruising quiet streets, breaking up domestic disputes, or chasing the occasional drunk staggering out of O'Malley's bar. But there was something about this night. Maybe it was the thick fog rolling off the river, or the way his radio crackled with static for no reason, that put him on edge. At 3:12 a.m., the call came through. Unit 5, we've got reports of a vagrant in the old Bellwood estate. Neighbors claim someone's trespassing. Can you check it out? Mike frowned. The Bellwood place had been abandoned for over 30 years, a sprawling, rotting mansion at the edge of town. It was the kind of place teenagers dared each other to enter on Halloween. Unit 5 responding, Mike replied, flipping on his lights and heading toward Bellwood Lane. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the iron gate hung at an odd angle, barely attached to its rusted hinges. Mike parked the cruiser and grabbed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the fog as he approached the house. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows like empty sockets staring back at him. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. "Silver Pines PD," Mike called out. "If anyone's in there, make yourself known." No answer. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his boots. The air was damp and smelled of mildew, with an underlying metallic tang that made his stomach churn. The house was a ruin, peeling wallpaper, furniture draped in sheets, cobwebs thick enough to choke on, but it wasn't empty. Footprints in the dust led deeper into the house. Mike followed the trail up a staircase, his flashlight illuminating strange stains on the walls. The footprints led to a room at the end of the hall, its door slightly open. He pushed it wider with his foot, gun drawn. The room was a bedroom, though it looked like no one had lived there in decades. A shattered mirror hung on the far wall, its jagged shards reflecting his flashlight beam. And then he saw it. A man was standing in the corner, his back to Mike. He was tall, with lanky limbs that didn't seem quite right, and his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Turn around now," Mike ordered, his voice firm. The man didn't move. Mike stepped closer, keeping his gun trained. "I said, turn around." Slowly, the figure turned. The face looking back at him wasn't human. It wasn't even close. The man's skin was pale and stretched too tightly over his skull. His eyes black pits that seemed to go on forever. His mouth was a jagged gash, too wide, filled with teeth that looked like they had been hammered into place. Mike froze, his mind racing. He wanted to pull the trigger, but something about the thing's gaze held him in place, like an invisible hand gripping his chest. Then it smiled. A sound filled the room. Low, guttural laughter that didn't come from the creature's mouth but seemed to echo all around him. "Mike," it said, its voice a rasping whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Mike stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. He fired a shot, the deafening crack shattering the silence. When he looked up, the figure was gone. The mirror on the far wall, however, wasn't empty. In the fractured glass, he saw his own reflection, but it wasn't moving the way he was. It smiled at him, its head tilting to mimic the creature's unnatural angle. The laughter returned, louder this time, and Mike spun around, expecting to see the thing standing behind him. Nothing. Heart pounding, he bolted from the room and down the stairs, desperate to get out of the house. But as he reached the front door, he skidded to a halt. The foyer was no longer empty. Dozens of figures stood there, all identical to the man from the bedroom. They stared at him with those hollow eyes, their jagged mouths opening and closing in unison, though no sound came out. "Mike," they whispered in unison. He turned and ran back into the house, desperate to find another way out. Every hallway seemed to lead back to the same bedroom. the shattered mirror waiting for him like an open wound. Finally, he stopped in front of the mirror, out of breath and shaking. His reflection stared back, but it wasn't him. It was the thing, grinning wider than ever. "Let me out," it said. Mike didn't think. He raised his gun and fired at the mirror. The glass exploded, and for a moment he thought he was free. But then the laughter came back, louder than ever, and the shards on the floor began to move. They floated upward, rearranging themselves into the shape of the creature. And this time, it stepped out of the frame. Mike's screams were the last sound heard that night. When his backup arrived hours later, they found his cruiser parked at the gate, engine still running. Inside the house, there was no sign of Mike. Only the mirror remained, its glass somehow intact. And if you looked closely, you could see Mike's reflection staring back, his face twisted into a silent scream. The mirror was removed from the house and placed in the evidence room at the Greywater Police Department, where it remains to this day. Sometimes officers say they hear laughter coming from the storage locker. Officer Frank Harris had seen a lot during his time on the force in Pine Creek, a small town where the days dragged on and the nights were quiet enough to make even a seasoned cop paranoid. He had seen the usual: drunks, petty thefts, domestic disputes. Nothing that really made his heart race. But tonight, something felt off. It was just past midnight, and Frank was doing his usual patrol through the woods near the old highway. Pine Creek wasn't exactly bustling with activity, but the woods were known to be the site of strange happenings. People said it was haunted, that something unnatural lurked in the trees. Frank never believed in that kind of stuff. Ghosts? Demons? He scoffed at it, but tonight was different. The radio crackled, pulling him out of his thoughts. Unit 3, we've got a report of suspicious activity near the old logging road. You're closest, check it out. Frank cursed under his breath. Of course it would be the logging road, an isolated stretch of road surrounded by dense forest. The perfect spot for anyone up to no good. Unit 3, copy, Frank responded, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter as he turned toward the logging road. The fog had rolled in thicker than usual, blanketing the trees and making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet in front of the cruiser. Frank slowed down as he reached the bend in the road, the headlights cutting through the mist. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Frank hit the brakes, the cruiser skidding slightly before coming to a stop. His heart raced and he instinctively reached for his flashlight, but the figure didn't move. He rolled down the window and called out, "Hey, what are you doing out here?" No response. The figure just stood there, tall and unnaturally still. Frank couldn't make out any details in the darkness, but something about the shape seemed wrong. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. His flashlight flicked on, its beam hitting the figure. It was a man, but his features were strange, almost too sharp, too angular. His face was pale, as if the life had been drained from it, and his eyes, they weren't right. Too wide, too black, the kind of eyes you only saw in nightmares. "Sir, are you okay?" Frank asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's lips twitched as though he was trying to smile but couldn't quite manage it. "I'm just waiting," the man said, his voice deep, hollow. "Waiting for what?" Frank asked, taking a cautious step forward. The man tilted his head slowly as if considering the question. "For the others," he finally replied. Frank's unease deepened. Something about this man wasn't right. Before he could say anything else, the radio crackled again. "Unit 3, we've received reports of unusual activity near your location. Stay on alert." Frank's eyes darted back to the man. "What are you talking about? Who are the others?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he began to move, slowly at first, his limbs jerking in unnatural ways as he stepped off the road and into the woods. His movements were erratic, like he wasn't quite in control of his body. Frank's hand instinctively reached for his gun, but he stopped himself. There was something about the man that made him hesitate. "Hey, stop!" Frank shouted, taking a step forward. But the man didn't stop. Without thinking, Frank rushed after him, following the figure into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around him, the fog making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The air was thick with a strange, musky scent, and Frank's heart hammered in his chest. He called out again, "Sir, stop." But there was no reply, just the sound of footsteps ahead, the crunching of leaves underfoot, and then nothing. The man had vanished. Frank paused, his breath heavy in the cool night air. He scanned the woods, but saw nothing. Not a sign of movement, not a single sound. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. The hairs on the back of Frank's neck stood on end. He turned to head back to the cruiser when a voice spoke behind him, a low whisper just on the edge of hearing. "You shouldn't have followed me, officer." Frank spun around, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. There, standing in the trees, was the man. But something had changed. His face was even more distorted now, like something was pulling at his skin. His eyes were no longer wide. They were sunken, deep pools of blackness that seemed to absorb all light. What do you want from me?" Frank stammered, taking a step back. The man's smile stretched unnaturally wide. "I don't want anything, officer," the man said, his voice now a garbled, almost mechanical tone. "But you'll want something before this is over." And with that, the man's form began to fade, melting into the fog like smoke, leaving only the eerie echo of his words hanging in the air. Frank stood there for a moment, paralyzed. He could still hear the faint whispering, like dozens of voices speaking at once. His head spun. He needed to get out of here. By the time Frank made it back to the cruiser, the fog had thickened and the woods were silent once again. He climbed into the car and slammed the door shut, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the radio. "Unit 3 requesting immediate backup. I need to report something strange." There was a long pause before the dispatcher responded. "Unit 3, we're not showing any unusual activity in your area. Are you sure everything's okay?" Frank's blood ran cold. He checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything, following him. But there was nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up once more as he heard a faint scratching noise from the back of the car. Slowly, Frank turned his head to look. In the rearview mirror, the man was there again, standing in the back seat, his face now impossibly close to Frank's, and he was smiling. It was a slow night for Officer Scott Langley. The streets of the small town of Hollow Ridge were nearly deserted, as usual, with only a few cars creeping through the fog and the occasional barking dog disturbing the silence. Scott had been on patrol long enough to know how to keep his mind busy. Checking his rearview mirror, his eyes lingered on the slow-moving car behind him. It wasn't unusual. People drove down this road all the time to get from one side of town to the other. But tonight, something about this car felt off. It was a nondescript sedan, dusty from the road, its headlights dim in the fog. Scott squinted through the mist, trying to make out the driver, but he couldn't see much. No big deal. He'd let it pass by, but the car stayed behind him. Too close. The driver wasn't overtaking him, wasn't turning off anywhere. They were just following. Scott didn't like that. In a small town like Hollow Ridge, people weren't usually out at this hour unless they had a reason, and most of the time, that reason wasn't a good one. He flicked on his siren, the sound sharp in the night air. He pulled over to the side of the road and waited. The sedan didn't speed up or pass him. It came to a slow stop behind him, the headlights flickering slightly before they went dim. "Great," Scott muttered to himself. "We're gonna have to do this the hard way." He got out of the cruiser, adjusting his uniform, and walked toward the sedan. The closer he got, the more his unease grew. The car seemed too quiet, too still, not even a faint sound of an engine running. He reached the driver's side window and knocked gently. No response. "Hey," Scott called, his voice a little sharper than he meant it to be. He reached for the door handle. It was unlocked, but there was no reason for someone to leave their car unlocked at this hour. He opened the door and peered inside. No one was there. The seat was perfectly adjusted, the way someone would sit if they were driving, hands on the wheel, arms slightly bent. But the car was empty. Scott stepped back, his heart rate quickening. There was no sign of a struggle, No indication that someone had gotten out in a hurry. The interior was dusty and smelled faintly of old cigarettes. The dashboard lights flickered weakly in the fog, casting an eerie glow across the empty car. That's when he saw it. In the passenger seat, resting on the floor, was a small black notebook. It was strange, out of place. Most people didn't leave their belongings in an abandoned car, especially a notebook like that. Curious, Scott bent down and picked it up. As soon as his fingers brushed the cover, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The book felt unnaturally heavy, and when he flipped it open, the pages were filled with strange, jagged handwriting, almost as if the words were carved into the paper rather than written with a pen. Some of the words didn't make sense, just random letters and numbers. Others were phrases that seemed unsettling. I hear them. They're behind me. They won't let me leave. She watches from the rear view. Scott's pulse quickened and his stomach twisted. He didn't want to look any further, but his curiosity got the best of him. He flipped through the pages, the writing getting more frantic as he turned the paper. Then, at the very back of the book, he found a page that sent a cold rush of terror through him. It was a drawing, a simple sketch of a person in the front seat of a car. But there was something wrong with it, something that shouldn't have been there. In the rearview mirror, the reflection showed another person, a man with hollow eyes and an expression that looked wrong. His face was pale, twisted, as though it had been distorted by something unnatural, and in his hand, he held the same notebook, the one Scott was holding. A voice broke the silence. "Are you gonna get in or not?" Scott snapped around, his heart in his throat. The voice came from the car, but no one was there. It was as if it had come from nowhere, just the air itself. He dropped the book onto the seat and backed away from the car. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup. Something's wrong here." There was a long pause before the dispatcher came through, sounding calm and distant. "Unit 4, we show no other vehicles in your area. Are you sure everything's all right?" Scott's eyes darted back to the sedan. It was still empty. Then, something even stranger happened. The headlights flickered once more, and in the reflection of the side mirror, he saw the man, standing behind him. He whipped around, his gun drawn, but the figure was gone. Panic surged through Scott as his eyes scanned the fog and the trees. He had to get away, but something about the situation kept him frozen. The whole town was silent, but in that silence, Scott could hear something moving, something faint, scraping against the asphalt. Suddenly, the voice came again, this time much closer. "Get in! They're waiting for you!" Scott spun around again, his pulse racing, but the fog swallowed up everything. The car, the man, everything. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore. His reflection in the side mirror showed the car still there, parked on the side of the road, and in the passenger seat, someone was sitting there now. The man with the hollow eyes was smiling. His expression was wide, far too wide for a human face. Scott ran back to his cruiser, the book still lying in the sedan, forgotten. He slammed the door and drove off, the eerie feeling of being watched never leaving him. The man's smile burned into his mind. It wasn't until the next morning that the car was found again, parked on the same road. The notebook was gone. But what they found in the driver's seat was worse, an old police badge belonging to Officer Scott Langley, abandoned and cracked. No one ever saw Scott again. They say he disappeared into the woods, lost in the fog, following the whispers of the man in the passenger seat. The car? It was never found. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, the people of Hollow Ridge still see the sedan on that lonely road parked just where Scott left it, waiting for someone else to get in. It was a humid Thursday night when Officer Greg Harper's routine patrol took a turn that would haunt him forever. The clock had just passed midnight, and Hollowbrook, a quiet town tucked between the woods and the highway, was as dead as it always was at that hour. Harper, with 15 years of experience on the force, knew the rhythms of this place. Not much ever happened here, at least not anything worth writing home about. Until that night. The radio crackled to life, dispatch's voice coming through. "Unit 12, we've got a strange one for you. Call came in from a payphone on Pine Street. Caller says they're being followed. We can't get any more details." No ID on the number. Might want to check it out. Harper glanced at his dashboard clock. Nothing to lose. He could swing by, check it out. He might even get to crack a case. It wasn't like anything exciting was going on. Pine Street was just a long stretch of road that cut through the old part of town, mostly residential, with a couple of shops and a greasy diner here and there. The payphone wasn't even in use half the time. People didn't use landlines anymore, especially not at this time of night. But a call for help. It couldn't hurt to check. He made the turn onto Pine Street, the headlights of his patrol car slicing through the thickening fog. The air had started to feel strange, like it was holding its breath, and the hairs on the back of Greg's neck stood up. As he approached the payphone, he noticed something odd. It wasn't just that the payphone was still there. No, that was normal enough. What was strange was the figure standing next to it. A man, tall and thin, standing perfectly still under the dim street lamp. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but even in the distance, Harper could make out the strange way the figure was holding himself, frozen, unnaturally still. Greg slowed the car, the wheels grinding against the wet asphalt. He rolled down his window and flashed his spotlight on the man. "Hey, you all right over there?" The figure didn't move. Harper pulled over and got out of the car, gun at his side just in case. This wasn't the first time he'd had a weird encounter at this old payphone, but something about tonight felt different. As he approached, the air seemed to grow colder, though the temperature hadn't dropped. "Sir," Greg called again, more forcefully this time. "You need help?" The man didn't respond. He was closer now, close enough to make out the man's features. His skin was pale, almost deathly so, and his lips were cracked and dry. His eyes were hidden beneath the hood, but Harper could see something glinting from under it, like two small reflective dots, almost like eyes, but not quite. Greg reached for his radio to call it in, but before he could press the button, the man spoke. "They're coming for me," he whispered, so quietly that Greg had to lean in to hear it. "What? Who's coming?" Greg asked, a chill creeping down his spine. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step back, turning slightly toward the payphone. "Wait!" Greg called, taking a step forward. "What do you mean?" The man didn't turn back. Instead, his hand shot out and grabbed the receiver of the payphone. Greg froze, watching the man's hand tighten around it. There was something wrong, something unnatural about the way he moved. His fingers seemed to bend at odd angles, as if his bones weren't quite where they should be. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the man dropped the receiver and took another step back. He was gone. The payphone had no dial tone, no connection. The line was dead. Greg's heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't move. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He glanced down at the ground where the man had been standing. There was nothing. No footprints, no sign of struggle, nothing to suggest he'd even been there. He took a few steps toward the payphone, his flashlight flicking over the area. That's when he saw it. A piece of paper crumpled up, lying near the phone. Greg bent down and picked it up. It was a receipt, or at least it looked like one, thin, worn and fading. But it wasn't from a store. It was dated that day, August 16th, but the time was listed as 3:15 a.m. The strange thing was, it wasn't from a local business. It was a receipt from a place that didn't exist anymore. Grimm's Hardware, closed 15 years. His stomach twisted. That wasn't right. Grimm's had gone under years ago after a fire, the building abandoned. No one had used that payphone in at least a decade. Greg stuffed the paper in his pocket, looking around once more. When he got back to the car, he keyed in the coordinates to Grimm's Hardware. To his surprise, the GPS didn't just show an empty lot, it showed a house. A small cabin, nestled back in the trees, hidden away from view. He knew the woods surrounding Hollowbrook well, had grown up in them, but he had never seen a house out there. He started the engine and made the drive. The fog had thickened again, swirling around his headlights as he drove deeper into the woods. The road turned from pavement to gravel, and the trees loomed over him like dark sentinels. His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Not with what he'd seen tonight. Eventually, the road ended at a clearing, and there, standing alone in the center, was the cabin. It looked old, abandoned, but there was something undeniably alive about it. The windows glowed faintly, and the air around it seemed to pulse, as if the house was breathing. Greg parked the car and got out slowly, hand on his gun, heart hammering in his chest. He approached the cabin, every step feeling like it could be his last. The door creaked open before he even had a chance to knock. Inside, a figure stood in the dim light. A man, tall and thin, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. "You came," the man said, his voice too calm, too knowing. Greg took a step back, the weight of realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. The figure stepped aside, and inside the cabin he saw something that made his blood run cold. The man wasn't alone. There were others, pale, gaunt figures, sitting motionless in the dark corners, all staring at him with those same hollow eyes. "They weren't human, not anymore. They all find us eventually," the man whispered. And then, from behind him, Greg heard a voice that was all too familiar. "It's time to go, Greg. You've been gone long enough." He turned. The man he had just seen by the payphone was standing there again, smiling, holding the crumpled receipt in his hand. Greg tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen in place, his mind screaming at him to do something, anything. But it was no use. As the fog swallowed him whole, Greg realized too late that sometimes the weirdest things cops find on patrol are the things that find them first. It was a Wednesday, just past midnight, when Officer Charlie Miller got the call. He had been patrolling the outskirts of Pine Hollow, a quiet town that didn't ask for much in the way of attention. He'd been with the department long enough to know that nothing exciting ever really happened here. Sure, there were the occasional speeding tickets, the drunks stumbling out of the Mill Tavern, but that was about it. Pine Hollow was the kind of place where you could leave your front door unlocked and nothing would be taken. It was the kind of place that bred complacency, but that night something felt different. "Unit 8, we got a call for you. Someone reported strange noises coming from the old Anderson barn off County Road 11. Caller didn't leave a name or number. Says it's coming from inside." The voice on the radio crackled. Charlie paused for a moment. The Anderson barn was abandoned. It had been for years. The old Anderson farm had been empty since the fire back in '88. Everyone knew it. The place was a pile of old wood and rusted metal, a forgotten piece of Pine Hollow's history. People in town said it was haunted, but most of them were just kids telling ghost stories, trying to scare each other on Halloween. Charlie wasn't buying it. "Copy that. I'll check it out," he said into the mic, before shifting his patrol car into gear. The road was narrow, winding through thick woods, and the headlights of Charlie's car barely cut through the fog that had settled on the ground. The closer he got to the barn, the more the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The fog seemed to cling to the trees, to the road, to everything, as if the town itself didn't want him to go any further. He passed the old farm gate, now hanging by a single rusty hinge, and saw the barn in the distance. It was exactly as he remembered, decaying, with a roof that looked like it could collapse at any moment. But something was off. A light was flickering through the cracks in the barn's rotting wood. The barn shouldn't have any power. There was no way someone could be inside. Not unless they'd hooked up a generator somehow. Charlie parked his car by the edge of the property, his flashlight in hand. He kept his gun tucked into his holster but within easy reach. There was no telling what or who could be in there, and he wasn't taking any chances. He approached the barn slowly, stepping over the overgrown grass and weeds that had taken over the yard. The door of the barn was slightly ajar, and the faint glow of light flickered through the crack. "Hello?" Charlie called, his voice echoing slightly in the still night air. "Anyone in there?" No answer. He pushed the door open just enough to squeeze inside. The light was coming from a single bulb hanging above a workbench at the far end of the barn. It was dim, casting strange shadows across the walls. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. But there was something else, a sound, soft, like the shuffle of feet across the dirt floor. Charlie stepped further into the barn, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Hello?" He called again, more cautiously this time. He froze when he saw the figure. A man was standing near the back of the barn, facing the wall. He was tall, thin, with ragged clothes that seemed to have been torn and weathered by time. His back was arched in an odd way, as though he was in some kind of pain. Charlie took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio. "Hey, you all right?" Charlie called, his voice sharp, but the man didn't respond. Charlie took another step, and then another. The man's head snapped around so quickly that Charlie's heart skipped a beat. His eyes were wide, hollow, like two dark pits that hadn't seen daylight in years. "Jesus," Charlie muttered, backing away slightly. The man's mouth opened, but instead of speaking, there was a low, guttural sound, something between a groan and a hiss. It was so unnatural that Charlie took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But before he could turn, the man spoke. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves crunching. "They don't let me leave," the man whispered. Charlie didn't know what to say. His mind raced through a dozen possible explanations. Was this some sort of prank? Some crazy local playing a joke on him? But the man didn't look like he was joking. He looked terrified, and his skin, pale and mottled, like he hadn't seen the sun in decades, only made the whole thing more disturbing. "What do you mean? Who won't let you leave?" Charlie asked, trying to stay calm. The man's eyes twitched. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, retreating toward the workbench. That's when Charlie noticed something. It wasn't just the man who was acting strange. The workbench, which should have been covered in dust and old tools, was clean. Too clean. And on the workbench, right in the center, was a large open jar of what looked like old pickled meat. Charlie's stomach lurched. There was something about the smell in the air now. Something rotten. And then, before Charlie could react, the man turned abruptly, disappearing into the shadows behind the workbench. Charlie wasn't sure what came over him. Maybe it was the smell, or the man's behavior, or maybe it was just a gut feeling. But Charlie wasn't about to let this slide. He moved toward the workbench, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He reached the jar, and as his eyes adjusted to the light, he felt his heart stop. The jar was full of fingers, dozens of them. Not just any fingers, though. They were discolored, shriveled, like they'd been preserved for years. And on top of the jar, scribbled in what looked like fresh blood, was a single word: help. Charlie stumbled back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing, and that's when he heard it again. The low, guttural hiss. He spun around. The man was standing there, just a few feet away now, his mouth twisted into a grin. "They never let me leave," he repeated, his voice now almost joyful. "But they'll let you. Just stay." Charlie's mind raced as he fumbled for his radio. His hand shook as he tried to get the words out. "Unit 8, this is Officer Miller. I need backup now." But before he could finish, the man lunged. There was no fight, no struggle. Just a cold, oppressive darkness that flooded the barn, choking the light from the bulb overhead. When backup arrived an hour later, they found the barn just as it had been. Empty. No man, no lights, no jar, nothing. Charlie Miller was never seen again. The only thing they found was his patrol car, parked on the side of County Road 11. The door was ajar, and in the dust on the dashboard, just under the windshield, were two words written in what looked like fresh blood: help. As for the Anderson barn, it's still there, waiting, but now it's just a little more quiet. It was a rainy night in late September when Officer John Adams received the call. He had been with the Pinefield Police Department for over 7 years, and in all that time, he had seen just about everything that could be expected from a small town in the middle of nowhere. Drunk drivers, petty thefts, the occasional bar brawl. Nothing ever too unusual. But that night, something felt different. Unit 7, we've got a 10 to 52 on Field Road, just past the old Ferguson place. Caller reports strange movement in the field. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. John rubbed his temples, wiping the rainwater that had begun to trickle down his face. Field Road was a stretch of empty land, nothing more than a long dirt road cutting through acres of farm fields. The Ferguson place had been abandoned for years, ever since Mr. Ferguson died of a heart attack. No one lived out there now. He flicked on his lights and radioed in a confirmation. "Copy that, 10-4. I'm headed out now." He drove through the winding streets of Pinefield, the rain slashing against his windshield, the wipers doing their best to keep up. The whole town felt suffocatingly quiet, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As he reached the edge of town, he turned onto Field Road, the tires of his patrol car crunching over gravel and wet earth. The further he drove, the darker it became. The streetlights were few and far between, and the rain kept pouring down, smudging the line of sight ahead. John's headlights swept over the barren fields, stretching out to both sides like a dark ocean. And then he saw it. A figures, moving in the distance. The shapes were strange, not quite human. At first John thought they might be animals, but they were too tall, too slender, and their movements weren't natural. They didn't walk, they glided, as though they were drifting above the ground. John slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. He leaned forward, squinting into the rain, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There were 4 of them, maybe more, standing in the middle of the field, just past the old farmhouse. Their limbs were too long, their faces obscured by the shadows, but John could feel their gaze even from a distance. They were watching him. His hand instinctively reached for his radio. He was about to call for backup when the sound of movement caught his attention. A soft rustle came from the passenger seat, then the back of the car. His eyes snapped to the mirrors, but he saw nothing. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. No, there was something wrong. He quickly threw the car in reverse, his foot slamming the gas. But before he could make it back onto the main road, the lights of his patrol car flickered. His engine sputtered. "What the hell?" The car stalled, the dashboard blinking in and out. John tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The rain beat harder on the roof, deafening. He pounded the steering wheel in frustration. His heart raced. He was isolated. His radio was dead. His only option was to leave the car and investigate. John grabbed his flashlight, pushing the door open and stepping out into the downpour. The cold water soaked through his boots immediately, but he didn't care. He had to see what was happening. The figures in the field had moved closer. They were no longer standing still. They were circling, walking in a strange, synchronized motion, as if they were practicing some kind of ritual. Their heads were tilted unnaturally to one side, like they were studying him. There were no faces, just smooth, pale skin where their features should have been. John's breath caught in his throat. He backed up a few steps, his flashlight shaking in his hands. There was something about the way they moved, like they didn't belong to the world he knew, like they were not human. As he stumbled backward, his foot hit something hard. He looked down and froze. It was a hand, a human hand, half buried in the mud, fingers twisted at odd angles. He knelt down, his fingers trembling as he brushed the dirt away, revealing the rest of the body. A man, pale, lifeless, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. John's blood ran cold. The man's clothes were familiar. He recognized the badge on the chest. It was Officer Chris Walker, another cop from Pinefield, one of John's own colleagues. John's mouth went dry as he stood up, backing away from the body. His breath was shallow, his heart racing. There was no time to think, no time to process. He had to get out of there. But the figures, they weren't just standing anymore. They were moving toward him, slowly, silently. They were closing in. John turned and ran, his legs carrying him faster than he thought was possible. His flashlight bounced wildly in his grip, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the sound of the rain. Behind him, he could hear them too. The faint sound of footfalls, too light to be human, but unmistakable. He made it back to the patrol car, his heart thudding in his chest. He tried to get in, but the door wouldn't open. It was jammed, as if someone had locked it from the inside. Panic clawed at him. He wasn't going to make it out. They were coming for him. That's when he saw it. A figure standing right beside his car, blocking the door. It was tall, too tall. The thing's head reached the top of the patrol car, Its limbs were impossibly long, stretching out like they were made of rubber. And its face? John's mind refused to process it. There was no face, just smooth white skin. The figure reached down, its hand curling around John's arm with an unsettling gentleness. It wasn't an attack. No, it was something worse. John's knees went weak. The rain poured down harder, but it didn't matter anymore. The world felt like it was slowing down. He could feel the thing's grip tightening, but it didn't hurt. It was as if the grip was sucking the life out of him. He looked into the thing's eyes, if they could be called eyes, and saw something that shouldn't be possible, a reflection. His own reflection, twisted and contorted, as though he were no longer himself, but something else, something dark. The last thing John saw before everything went black was the field, the figures, all of them, standing in perfect, silent formation, watching. By the time the other officers arrived, hours later, they found the patrol car empty. The engine was running, the lights flickering on and off, but there was no sign of Officer John Adams, no footprints, no body. Only one thing remained, a single piece of paper pressed against the windshield. On it, in neat handwriting, were 3 words: "They never leave." And for days afterward, the wind whispered through the fields, carrying with it the faintest echo of a voice.